going to open it with a prayer. If you'll bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for bringing us all together tonight safely. We thank you for the warmth here in the building and for this wonderful program that we're going to be listening to. And we thank you for Gulf Breeze. What an amazing place to be a part of. And just continue to bless us and protect us and take care of us. We love you and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And I would like to ask, I'm going to ask this gentleman right here, if you don't mind, if everybody would stand, and if you would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And we'll all say it together. And what's your name, sir?
Don.
Don? Okay.
Can we spell that for me?
An hour later.
Dawn.
Dolence. D-O-L-E-N-C-E.
Thank you.
And
Okay.
I am taking contributions.
Okay. All right.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I picked a good person. That was very, very good. And now, yes.
How many members are in the society?
Right now, we have about between 40 and 50 paid members. But we'd love to have a lot more. So, and whenever you pay, then that's annual till a year from that date. Yeah. And I'm going to now ask our vice. Oh, and I'm sorry, I didn't even introduce myself. So my name is Barbara Hewitt, and I'm the president of the Gulf Breeze Area Historical Society. And now I'm going to invite Jim Cox up. Jim is our vice president. He's the one that gets our wonderful programs. And if you'll come on up, Jim, I have you introduce our speaker for the evening.
We have a fabulous organization here called the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And Mike Thomin from the network is an expert on shipwrecks in the harbors of the Pensacola area. And he's agreed to talk to us tonight. So how about that?
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks so much. I'm going to see if I can pull this cord out a little bit because the one thing did I pull something out? I'm going to hit something. Stand by. Well, good thing I have a booming voice, right? Can everybody hear me okay? All right, I'll just scream the whole time. This is fine because I forgot my clicker, so I'm going to have to awkwardly come up here and press the key to transition to the next slide. But it's wonderful to be back here. It's been a while since I've given a talk here to the Gulf Breeze Historical Society. But as Jim said, my name is Mike Thomin. I work with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. We're actually a statewide program of the University of West Florida. So we are actually university employees, so I work for the University of West Florida. My official title is I'm a faculty research associate, which after like 6 years, I'm still trying to figure out what exactly that means. What it does mean is that I am faculty, but I don't actually have to formally teach classes and grade papers, which is awesome. I don't want to grade papers. But I do sit on different thesis committees, so we have both undergraduate and graduate programs at the University of West Florida, both in history as well as in archaeology. So we're one of only a handful of programs in the United States that actually offers a degree, both undergraduate and a graduate degree in archaeology, in underwater archaeology, in fact. So there's only 4 universities that you can get a degree in underwater archaeology in. And we're the only university out of those 4 that is actually on the water, okay? The others, they do really cool projects, ECU, East Carolina, Texas A&M, Miami, University of Miami in Indiana. They do great work, but they're not actually on the water, we are. And so one great thing about having a program is like that, a program that's on the water, is that our students and our faculty research our local area. And as a matter of fact, the very first underwater archaeology field school that took place at the University of West Florida was Deadman's Island back in 1990. And so I always like to start this talk by recognizing one of the individuals who started that here. And that was the former state underwater archaeologist, a guy named Roger Smith, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But it's because of Roger that we know all the stuff that I'll tell you today about Deadman's Island. And I'm so happy to see that we finally were able to beat the ancient alien crowd. We have more people. I don't know the official number, but hopefully it's more than that. But so my background is obviously in archaeology and in history. That's what my master's degree are in. I've been doing work with what we call public archaeology for 16 years now. I actually started working for the city of Fort Walton Beach, what we call Heritage Parking and Cultural Center. You know the Indian Temple Mound Museum. That's where I kind of got my start, was there. But I've been with the university and with FPAN, Florida Public Archaeology Network now, for 13 years. I was a military brat, so I lived in a lot of places, but we wound up here. My dad was Air Force, so I've been here for about 30 years. I'm in my 40s now, but I've been here for 30 years, and so it's one of my favorite places. And one of my favorite places in terms of archaeology and history is Deadman's Island. How many of you all have ever been out to Deadman's Island? So quite a few people in this room, which is not like, usually when I say that, it's like a couple hands come up, but I'm not too surprised being the fact that we're in Gulf Breeze right now. But it is really an amazingly rich area in terms of the history and the archaeology there. And so we're just going to kind of give a very brief snapshot of what that was, why it was significant, and we got the mic back.
Check.
I successfully stalled.
Check.
Perfect.
All right. You can even wander with it.
That's what I wanted. Awesome. Okay. I'm going to save my voice for tomorrow, so that's good. But so today's talk, we call it Deadman's Island, Pensacola Bay's unique landform. And so that's what we're going to talk about, just some different archaeology, some different history. This is just one little area. But with that said, our entire area, our Pensacola Bay system, has hundreds and hundreds of recorded archaeological sites all around this area, including in Gulf Breeze. And this is just a couple of them. All right, so for everybody here knows where Deadman's Island is. Yeah. Oh, lights? Yeah, sure. It might be easier to see if you can take the lights out. Just as long as you don't fall asleep. I'll try not to put you asleep. All right, so here's Google Maps or Earth image of the Pensacola Bay system. So of course you have East Bay and then Pensacola Bay, Scambia Bay, Butcher Pin Cove in that area. And so Deadman's Island, of course, for those of you who live here, you already know this, but some of you may not. It is that little red circle right there. That's Deadman's Island. And this is a close-up image of the greater Gulf Breeze area. Obviously, you see the 3 Mile Bridge or Happy Game Bridge there, which I think we have. This is probably the older image of it. Deadman's Island is just right there. That's Deadman's Island. It's an ancient coastal barrier island. It's actually not an island anymore. It's actually connected by land, but of course, the only way you can get to it is if you have property next to it or if you have a boat. And you can kayak out there. It's a migratory bird drop zone, so if you ever go to Deadman's Island, you'll see a lot of wildlife out there, including migratory birds. In terms of the ecosystem, it's a coastal maritime hammock, so it's got a lot of those live oak trees, sandy soil, so any sort of vegetation that can survive in that environment has been adapted to that environment, as you're going to see when you get out there. It's also historically has been an oyster habitat, and there's been more recent efforts to try to bring oysters back into Pensacola Bay through aquaculture. Pensacola Bay, Choctawhatchee Bay used to be chock full of oysters, and one way we know that is through the archaeology. We have many sites that we call shell middens. These are ancient mounds of shell that indigenous people created thousands of years ago, because what drew them to this area was not the farming. Anybody have tried to farm here? It doesn't usually work out too well unless you have like a raised garden. What drew people here was the maritime environment, was the maritime marine resources were very rich in things like shellfish and fish, and that's where they were collecting their food from, including oysters and other shellfish. But there's been some efforts to kind of bring that back, and there's a whole lot of great reasons for doing that. But that's a whole other topic. We won't get into that. But it's also a historic landscape, and it has been for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Here's another close-up. So just a couple different terminology in terms of geographic location names. So historically on maps, even today, this kind of point here is called Town Point. That's called Gilmore Bayou. You have this body of water right here that's part of the Pensacola Bay system. It was known historically and even today as Old Navy Cove. Oh, here we go. But you'll notice, here's, and then of course, which you can't really see because it's not in the right font color, but this is golf grease down here. But what you may have noticed is what I didn't call it. What did I not call this? Deadman's Island. If you look on historic maps, you will not find the name Deadman's Island. And I've looked at a lot of, my background is actually, that's what my master's is in, is actually maritime history. I published a number of articles, mostly on pirates. I had a book chapter that just came out earlier this year too, also on pirates. No pirates here, unfortunately, that's a different topic. But it's never historically called Deadman's Island. So where does that name come from? There's a couple different theories. The short answer is we don't really know. We just know that that's what we call it now. But there are some potential sources for where it got its name from. So one potential name came from this nautical term known as a deadman. And a deadman was basically anything that was large and heavy. So it could be like a big rock. It could be like the trunk of a tree or a tree itself that had fallen over that ships could tie up to so they could stay at anchor offshore and not float away. Those were known as deadmans. So it's possible, because of the historic use of Deadman's Island in terms of ship repair, that might be a potential reason why it was eventually called Deadman's Island. Second potential source is this book, Treasure Island. How many of you have read Treasure Island? Robert Louis Stevenson. So if you've never read Treasure Island, you probably know the story because every single Hollywood movie that came out after this book was written ripped off this story. All the pirate tropes you know of did not come from any sort of historical accuracy. It came from the imagination of Robert Louis Stevenson, whose father was a lighthouse keeper, and he was just bored. Can you imagine being a kid without a lighthouse? Probably pretty bored. So he came up with all these different stories. This was eventually one of them. But in 1961, the movie came out, and in that book and in the movie, they had this island known as Deadman's Island. So it's possible that the locals just named it after this popular movie that came out in 1961. And the last potential place where this name might originate came from the fact that there are literally dead people still buried on Deadman's Island. And in 2005, and we'll go into a little bit more detail a little bit later on in this presentation, but in 2005, locals had actually noticed something eroding out of the shoreline on Deadman's Island. And erosion has been a real big problem there that the city worked very hard at trying to shore that up over the last several decades. But in 2005, we had, I think, I can't remember which hurricane. I've been through a lot of them. Since Opal. That's how long I've been here, since Opal for the locals. But it was, which one? Dennis, yes, thank you. Yeah, so Dennis came through, and the locals were on the Deadman's Island, and they just were walking by, and they noticed these things eroding out. And eventually, archaeologists, we actually have, as part of our faculty, we have biological anthropologists. And so these are people who specialize in forensic anthropology. These are people who study human remains. They actually came out and they identified them as human remains. It was actually coffins. So there were people that were buried on this island. So there are a lot of reasons why it might get this name. That, like I said from the beginning, we don't really know exactly why, but we know historically it was never called Deadman's Island. We know that it was used for thousands of years because archaeologists have done surveys out at Deadman's Island. We have found evidence through pottery, through Native American pottery, that the human occupation, human use of this body of land dates back to at least what we call the Mississippian time period. So that's around 800 CE or Common Era, or AD. It means basically the same thing. So 800 or so CE all the way up to about 15 or 1600 Common Era, or AD. We don't think that people were living there year-round. We think that they were mostly using it as a place for resource extraction. So like I said, at one point in time, Pensacola Bay was chock full of oysters. And that's what drew people there. So we think that they were likely gathering shellfish and probably other marine resources from this body of water, but they weren't living there permanently, at least on Deadman's Island. They were on the main Gulf Breeze site, for sure, like where Gulf Islands National Seashore is at, Naval Live Oaks area. There was a very large indigenous settlement there for a very long time, but probably not on Deadman's Island. But we do know that when European colonization came into Florida, beginning in the 1500s, we know that this area was really valuable for particularly the Spanish, since they were the main ones colonizing this area beginning in the 1500s. They were mostly using this area as an area to repair their wooden sail ships. And if you look on this French map, you'll see that in the area where you have Deadman's Island, it says careenage. And careening was the practice of repairing wooden sailing ships from the time that they had wooden sailing ships all the way up until they, even today, they still use that term, careening. So here's a little bit of close-up. You can see on that, again, this is a French map. If you look at earlier Spanish maps, if you look at later Spanish maps, they also use the same term. They say it's a careening ground for their ships. And the reason why it was a careening ground is because you can see it gets very deep to very shallow very quickly. And that was perfect for sail ships because they could basically pull these ships up, even if they had really deep drafts. They could pull these ships up to land, and then they could repair the bottom of these vessels. And so that is what basically this area was used for hundreds and hundreds of years. You can see again on this map that it gets from relatively deep to pretty shallow very quickly. And here's an image showing you what careenage actually looked like. This is a fairly large vessel that they've pulled up. Now this is not of this area. This is of another area. This is not here locally, but the basic concept and practice of careening a ship was the same, whether you did it here or whether you did it anywhere else in the world. But basically they would get all the cargo, offload most of the cargo of these ships to make it a little bit more buoyant. Then they would pull these vessels up onto land, and then they would tilt it on its side, so then the carpenters could go do any repair work that they needed to. So get all the seaweed off, remove any barnacles or other shellfish that had attached to it. Any damaged wood, they would then remove and then replace. And then they would tilt it on its other side and then do the same operation all over again. So it's very, particularly with wooden sailing ships that were in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, they were faced really harsh conditions in terms of marine organisms that caused a lot of havoc with wooden sailing vessels. The main one here was the teredo worm, which was actually a mollusk. It was like, it's kind of like almost like a termite. I mean, it just eats wooden ships up. We know from log books, from British log books and from Spanish log books that careened in this area, that they would have to do it every few weeks. And sometimes there was a British warship that was here in 1778, so during the American Revolutionary War, called the HMS Mentor. And I actually have a copy of the logbook in my office. I didn't bring it. But if you look, they actually used this area to careen HMS Mentor, and it took a month to repair all the damage from the teredo worms. So not fun. So we've done a lot of archaeology, both the underwater side of it as well as some of the land, so I'll highlight a couple different examples of that. But again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more out there that we just don't have time to cover. But again, the first field school started in the late 1980s here under Dr. Roger Smith. One of the first things that they had identified on this island was this right here. And whenever we see shapes like this, it usually is not something that happens in nature. So it usually indicates some sort of human activity. Does anyone guess what this was? Barrel, yes, this is a barrel. Very good. So this is actually a barrel well. And so throughout the colonial time period, one of the common ways to get access to fresh water was, of course, you dig down, right? Eventually you're going to hit the water table, especially here. And so what they would do is they would dig down until they hit the water table, and to prevent the sides of those wells from caving in, they would take barrels off of ships, that they would store water or wine or beer, whatever you're storing in a barrel. They would take these old barrels and they would then lower them down into the holes and stack them on top of each other to keep the walls from falling in. So pretty smart, right? It was a really common practice. We find it all over colonial sites. This is actually downtown Pensacola. If you've ever been to, we call it the Museum Plaza now. It's a kind of green space that's behind the what used to be called the T.T. Wentworth Museum. Now it's called the Pensacola History Museum. But right behind in this area was where one of the commanding officers for both the British and the Spanish fortification. There was actually a fort downtown Pensacola one time called Fort San Miguel. But this barrel well was inside the quarters of one of the officers, and you can see it very clearly here. They've actually excavated it out entirely, and this wood was actually still preserved. All the wood above the water table had rotted away, but anything that was still waterlogged was actually preserved. And the remains of this barrel are actually inside our FPAN headquarters in downtown Pensacola. If you want to see it, you can go by our office. We have a museum. It's there. You can see the remnants of it. This has been excavating that barrel well. This was an interesting first underwater archaeology field school because they had to do very little scuba diving because it was so shallow. They could just snorkel, and if they had a question, they could just stand up and ask the question. Usually when we're doing underwater archaeology and we have all our scuba gear on, you can't do that. You have to communicate other ways. But this was a good way for people just getting in the field. What she's using here is called a water induction dredge. It's basically kind of like an underwater vacuum cleaner. It sucks up the water. On the other side, it's actually attached to a screen, and all that water dumps out of the screen, and they're able to then capture any artifacts that they might inadvertently suck up. What was great about barrel wells is that once they were no longer usable, for whatever reason, water went bad or water dried up, no good anymore, people often would just throw their trash down. So it's just a great, great way to get rid of your trash, which for archaeologists is fantastic, because now we have all these artifacts that are usually at the bottom of these barrel wells, and the same was here. With this particular barrel well, what they found inside of it was a lot of glassware, but they also found tons of iron fasteners and nails, which makes sense because we know what were they doing here?
Building.
Yeah, they were repairing ships, right? So, some of these nails are not salvageable for fasteners. And another one of the crates that they found close by, on the inside, they found leather shoe soles that were still intact. And that's another great thing about underwater archaeology is the preservation underwater is usually much better than it will be on drier land. And so probably what you're seeing, you can see the shape is different, right? So the shape of the barrel was a circle. Well, this shape is obviously not a circle, right? It's a square, which indicates that this was probably some sort of crate full of shoes that maybe when they were careening the ship, like I said, they had to get the cargo off of it. Maybe the sailor had a little bit too much to drink and it fell overboard and he just left it, right? Or maybe just tripped, who knows? That's the fun in archaeology, we get to interpret, right? He slipped.
No shoes.
So, yeah, he just slipped. It's heavy work. Or maybe the pulley broke, right?
The shoes. He had no shoes.
He had no shoes. Or maybe he should have not worn shoes, right? So we know it was used as a careenage for a really long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years. But we also know that eventually this area was used as a quarantine station. And so one thing that this area had always suffered from, at least as far back as 1761, that we have really good records for, is that this area of West Florida was constantly dealing with yellow fever. And so they did not know at the time, actually they didn't know until like the early 1900s what actually caused yellow fever, how it was transmitted. the doctor that actually figured that out. Does anybody know the doctor who figured out how yellow fever was transmitted? Yeah, Walter Reed. Walter Reed Medical, right? That's who it's named as. That's who figured it out. But it had been a problem. They just didn't know what caused it. But eventually they knew that something was happening. And so what they started to do was they established these quarantine stations because they could infer that sometimes when these ships would come into port, then the disease would spread. And a lot of times that was because of the mosquitoes that were in the holds of these ships. There was lots of water at the bottom of these ships that would stagnate. These eggs would be down there, and then they would hatch when they get into port. Those mosquitoes would spread the disease. They didn't know it was the mosquitoes at the time, but they could make a correlation between the ships coming into port and people getting sick. So they established these quarantine stations, one of which they eventually put on what is now Deadman's Island. And basically what they would do is if a ship had any disease on board, you would be quarantined. The ship would be fumigated, usually with like powdered sulfur. They just doused everything with sulfur. And then anybody that was sick, there was usually a hospital there that would then hopefully take care of them, but it didn't always work out. Sometimes people did pass away. And that's why usually when you have a quarantine station and a quarantine hospital, you also have a quarantine cemetery for the people who have unfortunately not made it. Here's an image from 1874 showing the quarantine station's location on Deadman's Island, on that old Navy Cove. Eventually that quarantine station was relocated to where, if you know where the EPA station's out on Pensacola Beach, that's where it was relocated to. So after Dennis, October 2005, again, I mentioned there's these reports. So basically what happened was, as this area eroded, these large trees were pulled out. They were uprooted. And when that happens at an archaeological site, it can cause a lot of damage to what is underneath it. Because what you have with trees, of course, are those root systems and those large root mats. And anything that it's connected to, once that tree is ripped out and pulled up, is also pulled out with it. And that's exactly what happened in this case. So as you can see, what's really interesting about this is you are not seeing the actual coffin. What you are seeing here is the roots, mats of the trees that had gotten inside the coffin. And all the wood of the coffin is gone. So it's like a perfect mold of the inside of the coffin. And we know from the shape of this coffin, that octagonal corner, that the Spanish did not do that. The Spanish typically buried in shrouds without coffins. Or if they did have coffins, they were boxed. They weren't octagonal shaped like that. But we know that the Americans and the British, this was more of their style, right? Was this. So these are probably more likely American burials related to the quarantine station. They found 8 of these coffins washed out. Some of them they actually did recover because they were completely washed out of their site. A few of the others they were actually able to stabilize because Florida state law actually protects all human burials, regardless of how old they are, regardless of their cultural affiliation, regardless of whether it's public or private property. It doesn't matter. Florida state law, statute 872, protects all human remains. So in cases where you can't put it back, obviously they couldn't put some of these back. But with the ones that they were able to actually shore up, they were able to successfully do that. But it's most likely that's probably what those remains are from, was that late 19th century quarantine station. There are a lot of shipwrecks also out by Deadman's Island. Sometimes you can see them, sometimes you can't. It just kind of depends on if they're uncovered or not. One of the shipwrecks was originally called Deadman's Island Wreck. And based on the artifacts that they found, based on the size of the ship, they knew that it probably dated from the British time period. So the British actually took over West Florida following the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. They lost, the Spanish lost the Florida possession to the British. So the British ruled West Florida and East Florida. They were the ones that cut us in half, made us 2 colonies, for about 20 years, up until the American Revolution. Based on the initial investigations, they had identified through historical records some different candidates that they knew were British vessels that dated from around this time period, and they theorized at the time that one of them could have potentially be the HMS Florida. And it was careened in 1778, and basically what they found when they careened it was that it was so damaged from teredo worms that it was not salvageable. So they took everything off it that they could. Obviously, we have an exhibit over here with some of the artifacts from it. They didn't get everything off of it, but they took everything off of it that they could, and then they just left it. They burned it to the waterline and left it, which is actually a common thing to do with ships as well. It was first recorded by that first field school in 1988, and then the underwater archaeologists conducted excavations in 1989. Here's an aerial shot. This is before drone sort of thing. So this is a shot taken from actually an airplane. Roger Smith actually hired a pilot who lived in Alabama who had a plane to come and just take pictures of the field school. So you can actually see the ship here that's all buoyed off, right? So you can see that shape of it. It's actually tilted on its side. It was tilted completely on its side. So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the bottom portions of the vessel that's left of it. This is some photos of that first field school. Again, like, they're not having to use scuba equipment. They can just pop up whenever they need to ask questions. Several years ago, myself and a couple of my colleagues were asked to help put this exhibit together. So we worked with one of the local carpenters who actually built these amazing cases, and we put that exhibit together. So all the information that's in there is about this. One new development has happened since we put that exhibit in, though, and that is that we know for sure that this was HMS Florida. We know that now through one of our students who wrote his master's thesis, a guy named A.J. Van Slyke. He was able to actually prove that this was HMS Florida. And what's really cool about HMS Florida is if you've ever seen maps of West Florida from the British time period, it's most likely a map by a guy whose name was George Galt. And this ship, HMS Florida, was his survey ship. This was the ship that he was sailing on when he was creating these maps of our coastlines that we have from this time period. So it's pretty significant for that reason. Unfortunately, because of shipwreck's reputation with more like pop culture really than anything, and that is usually when you say shipwreck, people automatically think treasure, right? You think treasure. Most shipwrecks actually did not have treasure on them. Some of the treasure fleets did, but they weren't really up in this area. This ship did not have treasure on it. It was a warship. But unfortunately, because of that association, in 1990, someone came by and basically blew the wreck apart. And so we really don't have much of it left anymore. So this is actually an image showing some of the remains of the vessel that had been blown apart and now washed on shore. So they did what they could in terms of trying to document salvage what they could, but unfortunately, that happened. Another wreck, this is called Town Point Wreck, and again, now through historical records, we know that this was the shallop of the HMS Florida. So this was a smaller ship that would be used for surveying into areas where this larger vessel couldn't get into. So like areas where they needed to have a shallower draft. This ship was part of that George Galt surveying expedition during the British time period. It was actually blown ashore in a hurricane in 1778, and then it was recorded back in 1991. But again, because of more recent research from some of our graduate students, we know that that's exactly what this vessel was now. Here's some of the things that they did recover from this wreck. You can see parts of brooms. You can see these balls that were parts of rigging for the ship. And again, these are made of wood, but because they were submerged underwater, they preserved. Other wrecks, so this is known as Deadman's Punt. So it's, again, you can tell from the shape that it obviously wasn't like a big sail ship. But these ships were probably used for careening purposes, because even though that it was used mostly for wooden sailing vessels during that colonial time period, we know that this area was also used up into the early 20th century also for ship repair. So it's very likely that this is one of the smaller vessels that they used in the careening operations going from one ship to the next. And there's a picture of it right there. Again, you can tell from the shape, that squared off shape, that's why it's probably a punt. Just by that shape. And that's what's great about maritime archaeologists is some of them construction. So we can look at how a ship is actually built and give you a good idea of what culture built it and what time period it came from, just by how it was constructed. Other indications, things like sheathing, so that HMS Florida had copper sheathing, so that was put on the bottom of the ship to try to prevent some of the torpedo worm damage. We know earlier Spanish vessels did not, they also used sheathing, but they didn't use copper, they used lead. And so with the 1559 wrecks that we often work on out in Pensacola Bay, that's what we'll find is that lead sheathing, not copper. That's later. Last but not least, I mentioned the careening went on into the 20th century. There was the Gulf of Mexico Marine Railroad Company in 1896 actually established another ship repair yard here. And what they constructed was this large railroad track that was run by steam engine, steam powered, and they were able to use that to then lift these massive ships up onto Deadman's Island and then also do whatever repair work they needed to do underneath the vessel. Unfortunately, it was destroyed. It didn't exist very long, only for about 10 years. In 1906, and 1916, and in 1926, we had really, really bad hurricanes every 10 years, which kind of seems like it's still every 10 years almost. But it was destroyed during that. And here's an image showing you some of these massive vessels. You can see the side of it. This is a person right here, right there in relation to that. So that's why they needed those rails to pull it up. If you go out there today, you can actually see remnants of those. So if you've ever driven over the bridge, or if you've ever been out there and you've noticed those brick pillars out there, that's what they're related to, is that later Gulf Marine terminal. So again, this is just a couple of the different sites that the University of West Florida has been able to investigate so far. This is called a magnetometer survey. So this was done in 2005. So basically the entire area, the waters surrounding Deadman's Island, the University of West Florida has done surveys at. And so a magnetometer is just a device that we use that can detect magnetic anomalies. So basically it's an underwater metal detector. And so usually when we get a hit, what that means is there's something that's ferrous, there's some iron underneath there, which of course will usually indicate things like a ship. It might be an anchor, it might be all the fasteners that it was put together with, but it can also indicate things like someone dumped a fridge there, or a Volkswagen Beetle, which also they found out in Pensacola Bay, right? So we found all sorts of stuff, but they have surveyed this whole area, but they haven't investigated everything they found so far. This was a side scan sonar. So magnetometer is one tool that underwater archaeologists use to help try to identify shipwrecks. Again, we're looking for ferrous metals. This with side scan sonar is actually using sound waves. Side scan sonar is a very accurate way to detect things like underwater shipwrecks, and you can usually tell it very clearly on side scan sonar. You can see right here, you have the bow of the ship here, and this is the center line right there. You can see the outer hull of it. It's probably also like the Deadman's Island, right? Probably tipped into the side of the sand. This one has not been investigated yet. So there's a lot that's still out there. Luckily, we have lots of graduate students that are always looking for thesis topics. So hopefully one of them will be like, hey, I wonder what this is, and come check it out. One thing that has constantly been an issue with Deadman's Island, of course, is erosion. This map actually shows the extent of erosion from 1940 up to 1992. So you can see that it's eroded pretty significantly. And in 2006, those little dots are where it was at in 2006. And so a lot of the erosion has happened because of just development, the revetments that were put out that kind of changed the course of the water. But the city has done a lot of different things over the years to try to prevent some of this, with some successes and still working at it. Big 810 feet of breakwater has been placed to try to stop erosion of this island. Tens of thousands of plants. So plants are great. Marshes are wonderful in terms of preventing erosion. Living shorelines are a great option in terms of trying to prevent some of that. It also has a lot of benefits in terms of helping to remove some of the pollutants from our waterways. Working on restoring the oyster habitat. I know they've had some success in some areas and maybe not so much in other areas. And they've also tried to build it up with some more sand, because this is currently the property since the 1974, I believe, is when it became the city of Gulf Breeze property. So it is owned by the city. here's some of those other efforts to try to stop some of that erosion. But of course, anytime we have a major storm, it's going to cause problems. The last time we really went out there and did any monitoring, obviously our concern, of course, is the archaeology there, because we saw what happened in 2005. So when Hurricane Michael hit, obviously it didn't affect us in this area as much as it did in some other areas of the Panhandle, like Panama City. We did get some water wave activity, and we were able to actually document the erosion that took place there in 2018. Luckily, we did not see any evidence of cultural resources being affected during that time. But that doesn't mean it won't happen again. Some other projects that have tried to slow down the erosion here, you see in 2000, this is before Hurricane Sally, 2019. But as you see, anytime we're going to have a storm, this is going to be an issue. And so it's really important, and it's, I really commend the city for taking the steps that they have to try to preserve this body of land. But lots of other things here. I will say that we've been talking with our friends over at the IFAS Extension, University of Florida's Extension Office, as well as Sea Grant, and they are planning to do a tour at Deadman's Island in early April. They haven't set the date yet, but this will be something that will be open to the public. So as those details come out, we have social media, we have like a Facebook page, we also have a website, FPAN.us. Once those dates are firmed up, we will be sure to put that information out there. So if you're interested in actually going out there and having not just archaeologists out there, but also ecologists to kind of talk about some of these issues, then that would be a great way to do it. And again, if you've never been out there, it'd be a great way to also get out there. And I think that's it. I know that was a little longer than I thought, but I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you may have, but I appreciate everybody coming out tonight and hearing what I have to say about Deadman's Island.
Are there any questions? Does anybody have anything that they want to ask?
Sure.
You may or may not know about it, there is a wreck that's straight out from Gilmore Bayou Entrance, and appeared to be, they thought was like a cement pole with all the timber laid in front. Is that one of the ones that's been investigated? Or do you know anything about that?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Like I said, a lot of these have not been investigated. Usually, if it's a known wreck, at least the state underwater archaeologists will come out and report that. I'm not sure about that one, but I have access to the database where all that goes, so I can give you my information and I can check and let you know. If it's not on there, we can get it on there. Yeah. Okay, I'll go here and we'll go there.
Little tidbit of information to pat myself on the back. When that land was gifted to the city of Guthries, Brett Martin, I made the appraisal of the island.
Oh wow, everybody give this guy a hand. Well, thank you for your work, that's awesome, yeah. That's.
I don't know whether I was right or wrong, but.
Do you remember what year? Was it 74, did I get that right?
I think, seems to me like it was after the fact. I think it was in 75.
Okay, well, that was out of the year, I don't know. We had a hand in the back, and then over here.
When we walk around out there, sometimes I find chunks of cast iron, like inch and a half thick, size of your hand, and it was my understanding that was the result of an explosion of a fertilizer plant or something that was there at one time.
Yeah, that's possible. That's correct. There was also a fertilizer plant out there. It also, sometimes when you walk out there, you'll see like little bits of it, just like we were describing. We call that slag. That's a byproduct of like metal working. We also know that they were, they had that Grinnell Road with the steam boilers out there. So it could be through that process too. So yeah, either one it could be of those. Yeah, but yeah, you will find a lot of that slag out there, and that's most likely from that later use from the late 1800s when the Gulf Marine Company was there. We had over here, and we'll come over here.
Whereabouts were those coffins found?
Oh, whereabouts were they found? About in the midway of the island today. We try not to give out specific location. Obviously, one concern that we have is what we saw with the Deadman's Island, right? Is that it's important to share this information, but we're often really cautious about giving exact locations, just because I don't think anybody in this room will go out there and try to dig up, but there are people out there like that. But yeah, I can tell you it's about in the middle portion of the island. We don't, unfortunately, have any really good maps of the extent of the cemetery. And that's actually a really big problem that we have in Florida is about half of our historic cemeteries, the state doesn't even know exactly where they are. So that's something that we've been working with the state on, trying to give them a lot more information, working with the local communities, for people who may know the extent of cemeteries or where they're at. If that's something that people are interested in, I can give you more information about that. But yeah, it's about in the middle portion of it. We don't know how many other burials were there. We don't really know.
Also, you didn't mention anything about brass and bronze, and I remember a lot of brass and bronze on some of those wrecks out there.
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly brass. I mean, fasteners sometimes are made out of that. But yeah, I mean, we found, but in terms of like treasure, I mean, those were not treasure coins, right? Yeah. I mean, even like the Luna ships, those were Spanish. Those were 11 ships with 1,500 people. They about 1 million pounds of food. So far on those wrecks, we found like 3 coins. Okay, they weren't coming here with treasure, right? They were coming here to colonize. Warships sometimes did carry treasure on them, just like you have a race truck, right? The bank is like, I'm going to put it on the most secure ship they can, and it would be the warship. But it's possible that there could have been some coins on the vessels, but
I'm talking about bars and spikes.
Spikes, yeah, for sure, spikes. Yeah, those would be used in ship construction. But yeah, you can see some of those over here, some of the iron ones as well on display. I saw a couple other hands. I'll come back to you.
Okay, now with the stuff that was under the water, you said was preserved.
Yeah.
When you bring it up, now you're familiar with the Kalita in Old Mobile Bay?
Clotilda?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They said they won't bring it up because it'll disintegrate. So when you bring stuff up, it's preserved?
So the moment you bring it up out of the water and it hits an aerobic environment, 2 things happen. One, air and oxygen hits it, so those organisms now can start to degrade it. And the other thing that happens is, over time, the wood cells, the cellulose of wood, will break down and eventually get replaced with the water. So when it's underwater, as long as that cell is still submerged in water, the cell structure stays intact. But the moment you bring it out and it starts to dry out, that cell structure collapses. And that's why that, if you leave it out and you don't treat it through conservation, yeah, it will absolutely disintegrate. All the wood that you see in this case and any other wood that we bring up out, including some pieces of Clotilda actually were taken out of the water and they're on display now at the Clotilda Museum in Mobile. Those went through a conservation process that basically replaces the cellulose that's been impregnated with water with a different chemical that we call PEG. They use sometimes other processes. Mostly what they use is PEG. But yeah, it absolutely must go through a conservation process. Fortunately, at the University of West Florida, we have a conservation lab. Actually, many things that were conserved in this case, including that piece of rope, were conserved at our lab. But depending on the material, it will have to go through a different conservation process. Gold and silver doesn't need much conservation. It doesn't really corrode, but we don't get much of that. But what you do get a lot of is like iron, and that corrodes pretty badly. And that has to go through a whole different process. But yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, but you're right. Absolutely. As soon as you bring it up, it starts to degrade. There have been ships that they have brought completely out of the water and preserved. There's the Vasa, that's a Swedish warship. If you ever go to Sweden, if you just Google it, it's literally like the whole ship they brought out of the water. There's a Mary Rose in England. In the United States, there's the Belle, that was a French ship. But it took 20 or 30 years of conservation and tens of millions of dollars to do that. So that's why they probably won't do that for Clotilda, just because it's going to be really expensive. Yes?
So, you see the monitor of the Merrimack they have brought up out.
That's right.
And they have it still in water
Yeah,
today.
yeah, and it's been how many years, right? 20, 30, yeah, it's a long time. So yeah, it's a very expensive process to do that, but yeah, it will degrade as soon as it hits the air, whether it's the metal or whether it's wood. I saw another hand. Okay, we'll come over here and then we'll go over there.
The very south side of the island, at some point that cut was made there, Do you know when that was?
That's a good question. I don't know.
When that cut was put in there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that particular cut, but
It looks like it cut the tip of the island off.
Right.
And remnants of that tip are still there. And they may have filled in where the old bayou was.
Gotcha, yeah.
It seems though, over the years, it's trying to reestablish itself to its original place.
Yeah, that's usually what happens, right? When they try to cut a pass here, like in the bar, right, in the 60s, it just kind of goes back in. Right?
And right there, where that cut was made, we call it the Deadman's Island mug hole, deep pit in the bay.
Yeah.
Is that a freshwater vent?
That's it. Again, I don't know the answer to that. That's a good theory. Yeah, yeah.
It is.
It is. Yeah.
It's a spring.
It's a spring.
Three springs that come out.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. It's good we have so many people. I can answer. All right. Let's go over here.
What did y'all do with the coffins and the remains?
Yeah, so like I said, so some of the coffins were left in place, the ones that they could shore up. The other remains actually went to our biological anthropologists, and they actually studied them. And then those remains, I believe, are with the state now. And I'm not sure like what the plans are with those remains. They probably won't rebury them in their original location because the original location's gone. Right. So, but right now the state. Anytime human remains are found, there's actually state law spells out exactly what will happen. So the first thing that happens when human remains are uncovered is you gotta call the police, right? Because it could be like a recent murder. So the first thing that happens is police will come in, the coroner will come in, and then they will determine whether they are 75 years or older. Now, if they're younger than 75 years, then it's detectives, right? It goes to police and it's an open investigation. If they're determined to be 75 years or older, then it's the state archaeologist gets involved. And then they're ultimately the ones that decide what happens.
And could they pinpoint how old the remains were?
There weren't a whole lot of, my understanding from the few remains that were actually, because you got to remember, we have very sandy acidic soil.
Right.
So most bones don't survive in this environment. Large bones can. So teeth, skull, parts of the jaw, larger like femurs. Some of those bones, my understanding is that they were able to actually recover some of them from those root mats. They had to pick out all those roots to actually get to them. I don't know, this was back in 2005. I don't know if they've ever done any like DNA analysis. My understanding is, again, I'm not a biological anthropologist, that's not my background. My understanding was that there were so few remains left that they could tell it was like an individual, but not much beyond that. But it's most likely that because there were so many of these coffins that they were in the same style, that indicate that it was an American time period. And based on the historical documents in the vicinity, our best guess is it was probably related to that quarantine station. But we can't put a precise year on it just yet. But yeah, that's a good question.
Just curious, about as far away from the 3 Mile Bridge to the east as Deadman Island is to the west, there's a huge hill of sand. And it showed up very clearly in one of your first slides.
Yeah.
We're out there boating, we always wonder, what the heck is the huge wall of sand? Was that from dredging, or is that natural?
I believe it's natural. I'm not any college. Does anybody in the room know this? I know what you're talking about. It's been used by people living in Gulf Breeze for a really, really long time. And in fact, back in the 1930s, before there was Gulf Islands National, now it's part of Gulf Islands National Seashore, the Naval Live Oaks area. But back in the 30s and 40s, there were Boy Scout camps. There was one on the sound side called Camp Big Heart was the boys one, and then there was a Girl Scout one called Camp Inky 45. But a lot of people don't know this, but on the bay side, there was also a Boy Scout camp, and it was the segregated camp that was established in the 1930s. And several years ago, I was doing an oral history project with some of the rangers out there, and I came across this gentleman who had a photo album. He had been a Boy Scout in the 50s and 60s, and one of the pictures were the segregated camp running up and down that hill. And this is in the 1930s. So my understanding is that it's natural, but in terms of like how what formation created that, I think that's beyond, that's geologists right there. But a lot of those other sand islands that you find out in, like Santa Rosa Sound. Those were absolutely dredged foils. That was from dredging the channel for the intercoastal waterway. Oh, one more. Last one, I think.
Do you know anything about the person Gilmore Bio's named after?
You know, I don't. That's a good question. But what I can do is give you my information and I'll check on that. But I don't know. Actually, how about the Golf Course Historical Society? Do you guys know?
Probably Meg Gilmore.
Well, like, yeah, I was gonna say Meg Gilmore.
Gilmore.
Yeah, there was a family. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to stick around after this.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was wonderful. And just as our tradition is here,
Oh, cookies. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And for those of you, if you'll bear with me for a minute, I've got a presentation to make, and I think it would be more meaningful if there's more people here. So I want to ask Rusty Kahn to come up for a minute.